My dad's will forced a DNA test to humiliate me, but the results flipped everything. My perfect sister, her favorite child isn't his, and my mom's 33-year-old lie got exposed. The lawyer handed me the DNA test results my dead father demanded in his will, and I expected to be humiliated one last time. Instead, I watched my perfect golden child sister, the one who got everything while I got nothing, turn ghost white as we discovered she wasn't his daughter at all. 33 years. 33 years of my mother's lies, my sister's golden pedestal, and me being treated like the family disappointment. But in that sterile office, holding those results, everything I thought I knew about my family just exploded.
Hey, story lover. Welcome to the Narrative Hub, Reddit Stories. Believe me, this adventure gets wild, but it's only epic with you. Seriously, you make this possible. Want more stories? Greater adventure? Smash subscribe right now. Smash like. Comment below. Let's go.
The air in Mr. Davis's office was thick enough to choke on. It smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and the slow, decaying death of a family. My father, Henry, had orchestrated this moment from his grave. It was his final masterpiece of cruelty, a perfectly designed stage to posthumously disown me, Kyle Stewart, the son he'd always considered a rounding error in his perfect life. I had driven to this appointment with my stomach churning, replaying every childhood memory where I'd fallen short of his impossible standards. The time I brought home a B+ in calculus, and he'd simply shaken his head, saying Jennifer would have gotten an A the Christmas morning when I was 12, and had excitedly shown him the model airplane I'd spent weeks building, only to watch his eyes drift over to Jennifer's perfect watercolor painting that was already being framed for his office wall. The graduation where he'd clapped politely for my business degree but had thrown a lavish party for Jennifer's law school acceptance letter. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every time he'd introduced me to his colleagues as my son Kyle, while Jennifer was always my brilliant daughter Jennifer, it all led to this moment. This final, public humiliation designed to cement what he'd always believed, that I was never worthy of the Stewart name. Across the polished mahogany table, my sister Jennifer Smith sat with her husband Mark. Jennifer was the sun around which our family orbited. Perfect grades, perfect marriage, perfect son, my nephew Noah, who my father had doted on as the true heir to his legacy. At 33 she still carried herself with the same confident grace that had made her homecoming queen, valedictorian, and the youngest partner at her law firm. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a flawless chignon, her designer suit immaculate despite the early hour. She shot me a look of pity mixed with a familiar, faint disgust. She thought she was here to witness my final excommunication. Mark, her husband of 8 years, sat beside her with the uncomfortable posture of someone who'd been dragged into family drama he didn't fully understand. He was a good man, kind, successful in his own right as a pediatric surgeon, but he'd never quite grasped the complex dynamics of the Stewart family. To him, family disputes were things that got resolved over dinner conversations, not elaborate posthumous revenge schemes involving DNA tests and contested wills. My mother, Barbara, sat beside Jennifer, her posture rigid, her face a mask of practiced sorrow for her late husband and barely concealed contempt for me. She was playing her part, the grieving matriarch. At 68 she still maintained the elegant beauty that had caught my father's eye 4 decades ago, though now it was enhanced by expensive procedures and a wardrobe that could fund a small country. Her fingers, adorned with my father's grandmother's rings, drummed nervously against her Hermes handbag. She thought she knew how this would end too. I sat alone on my side of the table. My wife Sarah had wanted to come for support, but I'd refused. Some humiliations are best endured in solitude. Besides, she was home with our 2 kids, Emma 7 and Jake 5, the grandchildren my father had barely acknowledged. When Jake had been born with a minor speech delay, my father had made pointed comments about genetic deficiencies while showering Noah, Jennifer's perfectly developing son, with attention and expensive toys. Mr. Davis, a man who looked like he'd been born in a 3-piece suit, cleared his throat. As you know, he began, his voice a dry rustle, Henry's will contained a specific and unusual codicil. Before the estate can be divided, a mandatory paternity test was to be administered to his son Kyle. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I'd known this was coming for 3 months, ever since the reading of the will. My father had planned this moment with meticulous care. The codicil was written in his own hand, dated just 6 months before his death from cancer, plenty of time for him to think through every cruel detail. In the event that Kyle Stewart is determined not to be my biological child, the codicil had read in my father's precise handwriting, all assets of the estate shall pass entirely to my daughter Jennifer Smith, née Stewart. Kyle Stewart shall receive no inheritance whatsoever and shall be forever barred from using the Stewart family name in any business capacity. He didn't need to say it, everyone knew. The implication hung in the air to prove he isn't mine. I could feel the smug satisfaction radiating from my sister. This was it, the final nail in the coffin of my belonging. For my entire life I was the shadow cast by Jennifer's blinding light. When I got a B, she had an A. When I struggled to find a job after college, she was already climbing the corporate ladder. When I had my kids, my father barely acknowledged them. But when Noah was born, he bought him a trust fund before he could even walk. The pattern had been established early and reinforced relentlessly. I was 7 when I brought home my first report card with mostly A's and 1 B in art class. Instead of praise, my father had frowned and said, "Jennifer never got a B." When I made the JV basketball team as a sophomore, he'd missed every game claiming work obligations, but he'd attended every single one of Jennifer's debate competitions, even the ones 3 states away. In high school, I'd thrown myself into different activities, hoping to find something that would earn his approval. I joined the robotics club thinking his engineering background might make him proud. He'd barely glanced at the regional trophy we'd won. I'd learned to play guitar and formed a band thinking music might bridge the gap between us. He complained about the noise and made us practice in the garage. I'd volunteered at the local animal shelter, thinking he'd appreciate my compassion. He'd called it a waste of time that could be better spent studying. Nothing I did was ever good enough, while everything Jennifer did was perfect. She was the rough draft, I was the polished final edition, or at least that's how it felt. My father made sure I knew it every single day through his words, his actions, and his conspicuous silences. "The lab couriered the results this morning," Mr. Davis continued, picking up a thick, sealed envelope from his desk. His office was a temple to old money and older traditions, floor-to-ceiling law books, oil paintings of stern-faced judges, a Persian rug that probably cost more than most people's cars. The sound of the paper tearing was like a gunshot in the silent room. I found myself holding my breath, my hands gripping the arms of the leather chair so tightly my knuckles had gone white. Across the table, I could see Jennifer's barely suppressed smile. She thought she was about to witness my final defeat. The moment when the family would be rid of its embarrassing weak link once and for all. My mother's eyes were fixed on the envelope with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. She'd been the architect of so much of my suffering, the one who'd whispered in my father's ear about my failures, who'd made sure Jennifer's accomplishments were always prominently displayed, while mine were relegated to forgotten corners of the house. He slid a single sheet out, his eyes scanning it. I braced myself. I prepared for the gut punch, the quiet shame, the "I told you so" looks from my mother and sister. I prepared to hear the words that would officially make me an outcast from my own family. In that moment, I thought about my children at home, innocent of this adult drama. How would I explain to Emma that Grandpa Henry had never really considered her father part of the family? How would I tell Jake that the reason his grandfather had never warmed to him was because he'd never believed Jake was really his great-grandson? But the lawyer's expression didn't change to pity. It morphed into confusion. He frowned, rereading the document. His brow furrowed and he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looking at the paper again as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. He looked up, but not at me. His gaze settled on my sister, Jennifer, and there was something in his expression that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. "Well," he said, his professional veneer cracking just a little, "this is unexpected." Jennifer shifted in her seat, annoyed by the delay in what she clearly expected to be my public humiliation. "Just get on with it, Christopher, we all know what it's going to say." She'd been friends with Mr. Davis since law school, had recommended him to our father when he decided to update his will. She spoke to him with the casual authority of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, never questioned whether she deserved the privileges she'd been born into. "Actually," Mr. Davis said, placing the paper flat on the table and turning it so we could all see it. His voice carried a strange note, something between bewilderment and professional discomfort. "We don't." He pointed to a line near the top with his Mont Blanc pen, the same pen my father had used to sign the codicil that was supposed to destroy me. "Kyle Stewart, paternity match with Henry Stewart, 99.998%. There is no doubt Kyle is Henry's biological son." The words hit the room like a physical force. I felt a dizzying wave of relief, so potent it almost buckled me. After 36 years of feeling like an imposter in my own family, like some cuckoo bird that had somehow ended up in the wrong nest, I finally had definitive proof that I belonged. But even as the relief flooded through me, I felt something else, a deep, abiding anger. My father had put me through this humiliation, had made me endure 3 months of knowing that his final act would be to publicly declare me an outsider, and for what? To prove something he should have known all along. I looked across the table at my mother, expecting to see some acknowledgement of what had just happened, some recognition that her son had just been vindicated after a lifetime of doubt. But her face had gone from smug to sheet white. Her eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen before, the kind of primal fear that comes from watching your worst nightmare unfold in real time. Jennifer just scoffed, a bitter, disbelieving sound that echoed off the oak-paneled walls. "So he was wrong," she snapped, her voice sharp with irritation rather than relief for her brother. "All that drama for nothing. Can we move on to the actual inheritance now?" But Mr. Davis wasn't finished. He held up a hand, and something in his gesture made my blood run cold. There was more. There was something else in those results that we hadn't heard yet. As a formality and to ensure the integrity of the lab's work, we submitted samples for all immediate family members, for cross-referencing purposes. He paused, and in that pause I felt the entire history of our family begin to shift and fracture. The results show that while Kyle is Henry's son, Jennifer, you are not. The words didn't just land, they detonated. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have its own weight. I could hear the tick of the antique clock on Mr. Davis's mantel, the distant hum of traffic outside, the almost imperceptible buzz of the fluorescent lights. But inside the room, it was as if the air itself had stopped moving. Jennifer's perfect, porcelain face shattered. The composed mask she'd worn her entire life cracked and fell away, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "What? That's impossible. It's a mistake. That's ridiculous," she stammered, her voice rising to a shrill shriek that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. She turned to our mother with the desperation of a drowning person reaching for a life preserver. "Mom, tell him he's wrong." But my mother couldn't speak. She was frozen, a statue of guilt carved from living flesh. Her eyes were locked on the paper, on the single line that had just vaporized her daughter's identity. The lie she had been protecting for 33 years had just been exposed by the one man she thought would never find out, her dead husband, reaching from beyond the grave with the very weapon he'd intended to use against me. I felt like I was floating, watching a movie of someone else's life unfold in slow motion. Me, the black sheep, the disappointment, the son who could never measure up. I was his. I was really, truly, biologically his. And Jennifer, the golden child, the princess, the heir apparent to the Stuart Empire, was a lie. My father's final act of spite, the bullet he had aimed directly at my heart, had ricocheted and hit the person he loved most in the world. The irony was so profound it was almost biblical in its scope. "There has to be a mistake," Jennifer repeated, but her voice was smaller now, less certain. She was grasping at straws, trying to find some rational explanation for the impossible. "Labs make mistakes all the time, mixed up samples, contaminated results. This can't be right." Mr. Davis cleared his throat gently. "Jennifer, these results were processed by 2 independent laboratories, both confirmed the same findings. There's no mistake." Mark, who had been silent through this entire revelation, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, confused, like a man trying to navigate through fog. "I don't understand. How is this possible, Barbara?" He looked at my mother, seeking some explanation that would make sense of this chaos. But my mother remained mute, trapped in her own private horror. The secret she'd carried for over 3 decades, the lie that had shaped every interaction in our family, had just been dragged into the harsh fluorescent light of Mr. Davis's office. I found my voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mom!" The word carried 36 years of questions, 36 years of wondering why I never seemed to fit, why nothing I did was ever good enough, why my father looked at me sometimes like I was a stranger he couldn't quite place. She finally looked at me, and the mask was completely gone now. In its place was a woman I didn't recognize, a haunted, broken person whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed around her. Her eyes were filled with a shame so profound it was almost black, like looking into the depths of a well at midnight. The car ride home was a symphony of chaos and silence, discord and shock weaving together into something almost unbearable. Jennifer was hysterical, cycling between screaming accusations at the lawyer, the lab, and the universe itself. Her perfect composure, the unshakable confidence that had carried her through 3 decades of life, had completely evaporated. "This is insane," she kept repeating, her voice raw from crying. This is absolutely insane. There's no way, no possible way that I'm not Dad's daughter. I look like him, I have his eyes, I have his laugh. Mark was trying to calm her, his own face pale and tight with confusion. He kept reaching for her hand, trying to offer comfort, but she was beyond consoling. She pulled away from his touch as if it burned, lost in her own private catastrophe. "We'll get our own test," she declared suddenly, wiping her nose with a tissue that was already soaked through. "We'll go to a different lab, a better lab. This is just some horrible mistake and we'll prove it." But even as she said it, I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. The absolute certainty that had defined her entire life was beginning to crack, and through those cracks, terrible possibilities were starting to seep in. Mark kept looking from his weeping wife to my mother, who sat in the front passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing landscape. She hadn't said a word since leaving Mr. Davis's office. Her silence was more damning than any confession, more terrifying than any scream. I was driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. I didn't trust myself to speak. I was replaying my entire life in my head, but with a new filter, a new understanding that was recoloring every memory. Every time my father had praised Jennifer while belittling me, every holiday where her gifts were extravagant and mine were an afterthought, every time my mother had said, "Just be more like your sister," her words now felt like a desperate attempt to reinforce a lie. It wasn't about favoritism, it was about concealment. They weren't just lifting Jennifer up, they were using her perfection to distract from her origin while using my flaws to make me an easy target, a scapegoat for attention in the house I never understood. The birthday parties where Jennifer got elaborate celebrations while mine were quiet family dinners. The graduations where my father's pride in her achievements seemed almost desperate, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as everyone else that she was his daughter. The way my mother had always pushed Jennifer to excel, to be perfect, to be beyond reproach. And the way they had treated me not just with indifference but with active disdain. As if my very existence was an inconvenience, a reminder of something they wanted to forget. But why? What secret was so huge that my mother would sacrifice one child to protect another? What truth was so devastating that she would let her son be emotionally destroyed rather than risk its exposure? The answer was waiting for us at home, in the suffocating quiet of the house my father had built with his own hands 40 years ago. The Tudor-style mansion on Elm Street had been our family's crown jewel, the symbol of Henry Stuart's success. Every room was perfectly appointed, every detail chosen to project an image of prosperity and respectability. We walked through the front door and the fight I expected didn't happen. Jennifer, exhausted from crying, simply collapsed onto the cream-colored sofa in the living room, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, the kind of deep, body-racking grief that comes from losing something fundamental about yourself. Mark stood by her side like a helpless guardian, one hand hovering over her back, unsure whether his touch would comfort or further upset her. His own world had been shaken too. If Jennifer wasn't Henry's daughter, what did that mean for their marriage, for their son Noah, for the life they'd built together? The real confrontation was between my mother and me. I followed her as she walked numbly through the foyer, past the family photos that now seemed like evidence of an elaborate deception, into the kitchen where she'd prepared thousands of meals while carrying the weight of this secret. She moved like a sleepwalker, going through the motions of normalcy. She opened a cabinet, took out a glass, filled it with water from the tap. But her hands were shaking so badly that the glass rattled against her teeth when she tried to take a sip. 33 years, I said, my voice barely a whisper but carrying the weight of more than 3 decades of pain. You let him do that to me for my entire life. Why? The question hung between us like a physical thing, heavy and inescapable. For a moment I thought she wasn't going to answer. She just stood there, staring down at the water glass as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Barbara finally looked at me and the mask was gone completely now. In its place was a woman I didn't recognize, a haunted, broken person whose carefully constructed facade had crumbled to dust. Her eyes were filled with a shame so profound it was almost black, like staring into the depths of an abyss. He would have left me, she breathed, the words so quiet I almost missed them. He would have ruined me. The confession was like a dam breaking. After 33 years of silence, the truth was finally starting to spill out and there was no stopping it now. Who? I pressed, my voice getting stronger as hers grew weaker. Who was it? She shook her head violently as if the motion could somehow erase the question, undo the moment, take us back to before the DNA results had destroyed everything. It doesn't matter. It matters, I roared, the years of repressed anger surging to the surface like lava from a long-dormant volcano. It matters to Jennifer, it matters to Mark and to Noah, and it damn well matters to me. I spent my whole life thinking I was the problem. Who is her father? My voice echoed off the kitchen walls, bouncing back at us like an accusation. From the living room, I could hear Jennifer's sobs grow quieter. As if she was straining to hear every word of this conversation that would determine the rest of her life. My mother flinched as if I'd struck her. She looked past me towards the living room where her daughter, her other daughter, was sobbing, her perfect world reduced to ashes in the span of a single afternoon. It was that sight, I think, that finally broke her completely. You have to understand, she whispered, her voice ragged and desperate. Henry and we were having trouble. He was so consumed with his work, so driven. The company was expanding, he was traveling constantly, and when he was home he was distant, distracted. I was lonely. She was trying to justify it, to make me understand the circumstances that had led to her betrayal. But nothing could justify what she'd done to me, what she'd put Jennifer through, what she'd done to our entire family. Her eyes drifted to the living room, to a silver-framed photo on the mantelpiece that I'd seen 1,000 times but never really looked at. It was a picture of my father and his best friend, his business partner, standing arm-in-arm at a company gala about 35 years ago. Two successful men in expensive tuxedos, celebrating another year of their thriving architectural firm. The man beside my father was someone who had been at every one of our birthdays, every Christmas dinner, every family celebration. Someone who had been woven into the fabric of our lives so completely that his presence was as natural as breathing. Someone we all called Uncle George. George Morrison, my father's business partner, his closest friend, the man who had been the best man at my parents' wedding. The man who had been like a second father to Jennifer and me our entire lives. My blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. No, I breathed, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Don't you dare. She didn't have to say it, I knew. The way Uncle George had always looked at Jennifer with a little extra warmth, a little extra attention. The way he always brought her a special, separate gift at Christmas, even when we were kids. The way his face would light up when she walked into a room, the way he'd hang on her every word when she talked about school or her job or her dreams. I'd always thought it was favoritism, another adult in Jennifer's corner, another person who preferred her to me, but it was never favoritism. It was something much more profound and much more devastating. It was paternal love, hidden and denied but as real as gravity. George, I said, his name falling from my lips like a stone into still water. My mother nodded, tears finally streaming down her face in rivers of guilt and grief. The affair was brief, she whispered, as if that somehow made it better. A desperate mistake fueled by loneliness on my part and a quiet, long-held affection on his. She confessed it all then, in a torrent of guilt-ridden whispers that painted a picture of deception so elaborate and so cruel that I could barely comprehend it. It had started innocently enough. George had been coming around more often when my father was traveling, ostensibly to check on us to make sure we were safe. He'd help with repairs around the house, join us for dinner when my father was away on business trips. He was kind, attentive, everything my father wasn't during those difficult months. The attraction had been building for years, she said, unspoken but undeniable. George had been in love with my mother since before she'd married my father, but he'd stepped aside when Henry had proposed. He'd been the gracious loser, the best friend who'd swallowed his feelings for the sake of friendship. But loneliness and proximity had worn down their defenses. One evening, when I was barely 2 years old and my father was on a month-long business trip to Europe, it had finally happened. A moment of weakness that had lasted only a few weeks but had consequences that would echo through 3 decades. When my mother discovered she was pregnant, she was terrified. Henry was a man of immense pride, someone who valued his reputation above almost everything else. If he had discovered that his wife had had an affair, that his business partner had betrayed him, that the child they were expecting might not be his, it would have destroyed him, and he would have destroyed her in return. So she'd made a choice. She'd passed Jennifer off as Henry's child and prayed that no one would ever look too closely, never doubt for a second that the beautiful little girl was a Stewart by blood as well as by name. And then, a year later I was born, the real thing, the anchor to her lie, the proof that her marriage was back on track. My existence gave credibility to Jennifer's, made it seem impossible that my mother could have been unfaithful when she'd been producing legitimate heirs to the Stewart name. But that created a different problem. Jennifer had to be perfect, absolutely, unimpeachably perfect, to ensure that Henry never looked too closely, never started asking questions, never began to doubt. Every award she won, every achievement she unlocked was another brick in the wall protecting my mother's secret. And me, I was the acceptable loss. My struggles, my imperfections, they made Jennifer shine brighter by comparison. My father's disdain for me was a convenient tool my mother used to keep his focus away from the devastating truth. She didn't just allow my father to treat me like an outcast, she encouraged it. Every time he criticized me, every time he held Jennifer up as the example I should follow, every time he made it clear that I was the disappointment, my mother stayed silent, or worse, she agreed. It was the price of her survival, she said. But it had cost me my childhood, my self-esteem, my sense of belonging in my own family. You sacrificed me, I said, the words coming out flat and lifeless. You threw me away to protect yourself. I thought it would be easier, she whispered. I thought if Henry focused on your failures he wouldn't notice anything unusual about Jennifer's successes. I thought I could protect all of us. You protected yourself, I corrected. You destroyed me to save your own skin. The revelation was a contagion, spreading through the house like poison gas. It infected every memory, twisted every shared moment into something ugly and unrecognizable. Jennifer heard it. I saw the moment she understood, her head snapping up from the sofa cushions, her face a mask of horrified comprehension. Her father wasn't just some anonymous stranger, some random man her mother had met in a moment of weakness. Her father was Uncle George, the man who had taught her how to ride a bike in this very driveway, the man who had attended every school play, every graduation, every important moment in her life, the man whose own children she had grown up with, calling them her cousins without ever knowing they were actually her half-siblings. Her grief transformed into pure, unadulterated rage. She launched herself not at my mother but at me, as if I were somehow responsible for this catastrophe. You, she screamed, her face contorted with fury and desperation. You did this, you couldn't just fail the test and disappear, you had to ruin everything. Her accusation was so absurd, so completely divorced from reality that I could only stare at her. She was blaming me for her own illegitimacy, as if I had somehow engineered this revelation, as if I had orchestrated our father's posthumous revenge from beyond the grave. Mark pulled her back before she could reach me, his own shock evident in every line of his body. Jenny, stop, it's not his fault. It's all his fault? She shrieked, her perfect composure completely shattered, replaced by the raw panic of someone whose entire foundation had just been liquefied. If he hadn't taken that stupid test, none of this would have happened, we could have just lived our lives. But that was the cruelest irony of all. I hadn't wanted to take the test. I'd known it was designed to humiliate me, to provide my father with one final opportunity to reject me from beyond the grave. But the terms of the will had been clear: no test, no inheritance for anyone. My father, in his twisted genius, had made sure that I would have to participate in my own humiliation. He'd assumed that the DNA test would prove I wasn't his son, that it would justify a lifetime of treating me like an unwanted stranger. Instead, it had revealed the real stranger in our family, the cuckoo in our nest. And now Jennifer was falling apart, her entire sense of self crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. The woman who had never doubted her place in the world, who had moved through life with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and where she belonged, was discovering that everything she'd believed about herself was a lie. My mother wasn't even there. She'd suffered what her doctor generously called a nervous breakdown and was currently under sedation at a private psychiatric facility. The weight of her 33-year-old lie had finally crushed her completely. Mark sat beside Jennifer, but there was a distance between them now that hadn't been there a week ago. The foundation of their marriage had been built, in part, on Jennifer's identity as a steward, on her inheritance, on the legacy she was supposed to pass down to their son. Now all of that was in question. "The will is very clear," Mr. Davis stated, his tone devoid of emotion. He was being careful, clinical, treating this like any other legal matter rather than the family tragedy it had become. "Henry's estate in its entirety is to be passed down to his direct bloodline. There are specific clauses invalidating any claims from non-biological issue." He was a lawyer speaking in the careful language of the law, but the translation was brutally simple. Jennifer got nothing. The houses, the investment portfolios, the controlling shares in the company, the art collection, the various trusts and foundations, all of it passes to the sole biological heir, he continued, his voice as emotionless as a computer reading data. He looked directly at me and I saw something in his expression that might have been pity. "It all goes to you, Kyle." The number he quoted was astronomical, life-changing in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. My father's estate was worth just over $47 million. The company alone was valued at $32 million, with the rest made up of real estate, investments, and various other assets accumulated over 4 decades of relentless work. I felt nothing, no victory, no satisfaction, no sense of justice finally being served. All I could think about was the cost, the 33 years of lies, the destroyed relationships, the shattered lives. Jennifer made a choked sound and fled the room, her high heels clicking against the marble floor like gunshots. Mark hesitated for a moment, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, before following his wife out into the hallway. I was left alone in the silent office, the new king of a kingdom built on ashes and lies. The days that followed were a blur of legal paperwork, financial meetings, and difficult conversations. I had to see George. The confrontation couldn't be avoided, even though every fiber of my being recoiled from it. I found him in his garden on a Saturday morning, an old man now at 74, carefully pruning his prized roses. His hair had gone completely white, and his hands shook slightly as he worked, but he still moved with the careful precision that had made him one of the most successful architects in the state. When he saw me walking across his lawn, he seemed to shrink, the weight of his 33-year-old secret finally crushing him. He straightened slowly, setting down his pruning shears, and looked at me with eyes that held a lifetime of regret. He didn't deny it, he didn't try to explain or justify or minimize what he'd done. He just nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of 3 decades of guilt. "I wondered if this day would ever come," he said quietly. "Part of me hoped it would, part of me was terrified it would." We talked for hours, sitting on his back porch while the afternoon shadows grew longer. He told me about loving my mother from afar, about the brief affair that had produced Jennifer, about the agony of watching another man raise his daughter while he remained on the periphery of her life. "I was a coward," he said simply. "I let Barbara make all the choices and I spent the rest of my life living with the consequences. I watched Henry treat you terribly and I said nothing because I was afraid of losing what little connection I had to Jennifer." He'd sent her birthday cards every year, had made sure to be at every important event in her life, had quietly funded some of her college expenses through anonymous scholarships. He'd been as much of a father as he could be while maintaining the fiction that he was just Uncle George, the family friend. "Does she know?" he asked. "Have you told her?" "She knows," I said, "but I don't think she's ready to deal with it yet." He nodded understanding. "And now, what happens now?" I didn't have an answer for him. The future seemed as murky and uncertain as the past had been full of lies. Jennifer, predictably, cut both George and our mother out of her life completely. She refused to take their calls, returned their letters unopened, and made it clear through Mark that any attempt to contact her would be met with legal action. Her marriage to Mark became strained almost immediately. The foundation of their relationship had been built, in part, on certain assumptions about who Jennifer was, where she came from, what kind of legacy she would pass down to their son. Now all of that was in question. Noah, at 10 years old, was caught in the middle of adult chaos he couldn't possibly understand. One day he had a grandfather who adored him, uncles and aunts and cousins on both sides of the family, a clear sense of his place in the world. The next day half his family had vanished, his mother was crying constantly, and nobody would explain why. "Why can't I see Grandma Barbara anymore?" he asked me one afternoon when I'd stopped by to pick up some of Jennifer's things from the family house. She'd asked Mark to handle the interaction, unable to face me herself. I knelt down to his level, this beautiful child who looked so much like Jennifer, and tried to find words that would make sense to a 10-year-old. "Sometimes adults make mistakes," I said finally. "Big mistakes that hurt people, and sometimes it takes time to figure out how to fix things." "Did Grandma Barbara make a mistake?" he asked, his young face serious and worried. "Yes," I said, "she did, a very big one." "Are you going to fix it?" The innocent question hit me like a physical blow. How do you explain to a child that some mistakes can't be fixed, that some lies are too big and have gone on for too long? How do you tell him that the adults he trusted to keep his world stable had been living in a house of cards that had finally collapsed? "I'm going to try," I said, because it was the only answer I could give. But fixing things seemed impossible. The revelation had created fault lines that ran through every relationship in our family. My mother remained hospitalized, her doctors saying she was suffering from severe depression and anxiety. She'd retreated so far into herself that she barely responded to visitors, spending her days staring out the window of her private room. Jennifer had thrown herself into her work with a manic intensity, taking on more cases, working longer hours as if she could somehow outrun the truth by staying busy enough. Mark told me she barely slept, barely ate, and had started seeing a therapist 3 times a week. "She keeps saying she doesn't know who she is anymore," Mark confided in me during one of our awkward conversations. "She's lost 20 pounds, Kyle, she's falling apart and I don't know how to help her." The irony wasn't lost on me. For 33 years, Jennifer had been the golden child, the one who had everything handed to her while I'd struggled with feelings of inadequacy and abandonment. Now our positions were reversed and I found myself with everything while she had nothing, not even her sense of self. The business required immediate attention. Stewart and Morrison architectural firm had been built by my father and George over 4 decades, and it employed nearly 200 people. With my father dead and the truth about George's relationship to our family exposed, the company needed new leadership. I'd never wanted to go into architecture. My degree was in business and I'd spent my career in marketing and consulting. But suddenly I found myself the majority owner of one of the state's most successful architectural firms, responsible for projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. George, to his credit, didn't try to fight the transition. He announced his retirement effective immediately and turned over all his responsibilities to me without complaint. "It's your father's company now," he said during our final business meeting. "It should have been yours all along." But taking over the company meant working in the building my father had designed, sitting in the office he'd occupied for decades, making decisions he would have made. Every day, I was surrounded by reminders of the man who had spent my entire life making me feel worthless. The employees were confused and concerned. They'd known me as Henry's disappointing son, the one who'd never shown much interest in the family business. Now I was suddenly their boss and they didn't know what to expect. "Mr. Stewart," my father's longtime secretary, Mrs. Chen, said during my first week, "there are some people here who are worried about job security with all the changes." "Nothing's changing in terms of employment," I assured her. "Everyone who wants to stay can stay. This company will continue operating exactly as it always has." But that wasn't entirely true. I couldn't continue operating exactly as my father had. He'd been brilliant but ruthless, demanding perfection from his employees and cutting loose anyone who couldn't meet his impossible standards. I'd been on the receiving end of that perfectionism my entire life, and I knew how destructive it could be. I instituted new policies, better benefits, more flexible working arrangements, a more collaborative approach to projects. The changes were well received, but they also felt like I was systematically dismantling everything my father had built. Sarah, my wife, tried to be supportive, but the sudden wealth and responsibility were overwhelming for both of us. We'd gone from a comfortable middle-class life to being multimillionaires almost overnight. Our children had to be enrolled in private schools for security reasons. We had to hire a financial advisor, an accountant, a lawyer to help manage the estate. "This isn't what I signed up for," Sarah said one evening after a particularly difficult day. "I married Kyle Stewart, the marketing consultant. I don't know who this person is." She was right. The revelation had changed everything, not just about my family history but about my future. I was no longer just Jennifer's disappointing brother or Henry's inadequate son. I was a business owner, a community leader, someone with real influence and responsibility. But with that came isolation. Old friends treated me differently now, either with new deference because of my wealth or with suspicion about my motives. New acquaintances were often more interested in my money than in me as a person. 6 months after the DNA revelation, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I reached out to Jennifer. She agreed to meet me at a neutral location, a small cafe downtown where we'd never been together, a place with no family memories to complicate the conversation. She looked terrible. Mark hadn't been exaggerating about the weight loss. Her clothes hung loose on her frame and there were dark circles under her eyes that even her expertly applied makeup couldn't hide. But she sat across from me with the same rigid posture she'd always maintained, her armor of perfectionism still intact even though everything underneath had crumbled. "What do you want, Kyle?" she asked without preamble. "I want to talk about the future," I said. "About the company, about the family, about Noah." Her face hardened at the mention of her son. "Noah is none of your concern." "He's my nephew," I said. "That hasn't changed." "Everything has changed," she snapped. "We're not siblings, we're nothing to each other." "We grew up in the same house," I said. "We shared the same experiences, we have the same mother even if we don't have the same father, that has to count for something." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The same experiences? Kyle, you have no idea what my experiences were. You think being the golden child was some kind of gift, but do you know what it was really like?" I waited, sensing that she needed to say this, that it had been building up inside her for months. "It was terrifying," she continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "Every single day I had to be perfect, not good, not even excellent, perfect, because anything less than perfection was unacceptable. Do you know what it's like to live your entire life knowing that one mistake, one failure could destroy everything?" Her words hit me like a revelation. I'd spent my life envying her perfection, never considering that it might have been as much of a prison as my father's disappointment had been. "When I was 8, she continued, I brought home a test with a 98% on it. Do you know what Dad said? He asked me what happened to the other 2%. When I was in high school and got the lead in the school play, he asked why I hadn't also won the Academic Excellence Award that year. It was never enough, Kyle, nothing was ever enough." "But he loved you," I said weakly. "Did he?" she asked. "Or did he love the idea of me, the perfect daughter who proved what a successful man he was? I spent my entire life trying to earn love that was conditional on my performance, and now I find out that even that was based on a lie." We sat in silence for a few minutes, two people who had grown up in the same house but had lived completely different lives. "The company needs you," I said finally. She looked up sharply. "What?" "Stewart and Morrison, you're a brilliant lawyer, you understand business, you know the industry. I need a partner and you need something, a purpose, a way forward." "You want me to work for you?" she asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "I want you to work with me," I corrected. "As an equal partner, we'll restructure the ownership, you get 40%, I keep 60%, we run it together." She stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's what Dad would have wanted," I said. "Before all this, when he thought you were his daughter, this is what he would have wanted, his children running his company together." "But I'm not his daughter," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You're still my sister," I said. "Biology doesn't change that." For the first time since the revelation, I saw tears in her eyes. Real tears, not the angry, desperate crying of that first day, but something deeper and more genuine. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "Neither do I admitted, "but maybe we can figure it out together." It wasn't an immediate reconciliation. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But it was a beginning. Jennifer started working at the firm on a part-time basis, handling legal matters and gradually taking on more responsibility. The arrangement benefited both of us. She had a sense of purpose again, something to focus on besides her shattered identity. And I had someone who understood the business, who could help me navigate the complex world I'd inherited. Working together also gave us opportunities to talk, to process what had happened to our family, to try to understand how we'd ended up where we were. I keep thinking about all the signs, Jennifer said one afternoon as we reviewed contracts in the conference room that had once been my father's private domain. Uncle George always treated me differently. Special gifts, extra attention. I thought it was because I was Dad's favorite, so everyone wanted to be nice to me, but it wasn't that at all. He was trying to be a father to you in the only way he could, I said. And I never knew, she said. All those years I had a father who loved me, who wanted to be part of my life, and I never knew because of Mom's lie. We talked about our mother too, who remained hospitalized with no clear timeline for recovery. The doctors said she was making progress but slowly. The weight of carrying such a massive secret for over 3 decades had taken a toll that couldn't be quickly repaired. Do you think you'll ever forgive her? Jennifer asked. It was a question I'd been wrestling with since that first day in Mr. Davis's office. I don't know, I said honestly. What she did to me was devastating, but what she did to you might have been worse. At least I always knew something was wrong. You lived your entire life not knowing who you really were. Sometimes I think ignorance was better, Jennifer said. At least when I didn't know the truth, I had an identity. Now I feel like I'm floating in space with nothing to hold onto. But gradually, she began to find new anchors. Her relationship with Mark started to stabilize as they worked through the implications of the revelation with their therapist. Noah, resilient in the way that children can be, adapted to the new family dynamics more easily than the adults. And slowly, carefully, Jennifer began to rebuild a relationship with George. It started with a letter, the first communication they'd had since that terrible day in the lawyer's office. George wrote to her about his regrets, about the love he'd carried for her all these years, about his hope that someday they might be able to have an honest relationship. Jennifer showed me the letter before responding to it. Her hands shook as she held the pages, and I could see the war between anger and longing playing out across her face. What should I say? She asked. What do you want to say? I replied. I want to scream at him, she said. I want to tell him how angry I am that he let me live my entire life not knowing who my real father was, but I also want to know him, the real him, not just Uncle George. Her first meeting with George was awkward and emotional. She came back to the office afterward with red eyes and a shell-shocked expression, but she also seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. He showed me pictures, she said, pictures of me that he'd kept all these years, pictures from school plays and graduations and my wedding. He was there for everything, Kyle. All those times I thought he was just being nice to Dad's daughter, he was being my father. Over the months that followed, they began to build a real relationship. George taught Jennifer about her half-siblings, his children from his marriage, her biological brothers and sister who had been her cousins all her life. It was complicated and sometimes painful, but it was also healing. As for me, I found myself in the strange position of having to learn how to be successful, how to be respected, how to be the person my father had always wanted me to be. It wasn't easy. 36 years of being told you're a disappointment doesn't disappear overnight. But slowly I began to understand something my father never had. Success isn't just about achievement or perfection. It's about resilience, about the ability to adapt and grow, about finding meaning in the midst of chaos. The company thrived under our joint leadership. Jennifer's legal expertise and my business background complemented each other well, and the employees responded positively to our more collaborative approach. We won several major projects that year, including a contract to design a new city hall that would have made my father proud. On the 1-year anniversary of the DNA revelation, Jennifer and I stood in my father's old office, now mine, looking out at the city skyline. The room had been redecorated, the harsh lines and cold colors my father had preferred replaced with warmer tones and more comfortable furniture. Do you think he knew? Jennifer asked suddenly. Do you think Dad suspected the truth but couldn't admit it to himself? It was a question I'd been pondering for months. Looking back, there were moments when my father's behavior toward me had seemed less like disappointment and more like guilt. Times when he'd started to praise me for something, then caught himself and found fault instead. Times when he'd looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite identify. Maybe, I said, maybe part of him knew that his cruelty toward me was unjustified, but he couldn't face the alternative explanation. He was a coward, Jennifer said, and there was no anger in her voice anymore, just sadness. Just like George was a coward, just like Mom was a coward, they all chose the easy lie instead of the difficult truth. And what about us? I asked. What do we choose? She looked at me with an expression that held 33 years of shared history despite everything we'd learned about our different origins. We choose to be better than they were, she said. We choose honesty. Even when it's hard, we choose family, even when it's complicated. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Our mother eventually recovered enough to leave the hospital, but her relationship with both of us remained strained and careful. George became a part of Jennifer's life, but the lost decades couldn't be recovered. Mark and Jennifer's marriage survived, but it was different now.